Uncle Devin, why is that police officer looking at you like you did something wrong when you're the one who protects people? The 10-year-old's innocent question would prove more prophetic than anyone could imagine. Within the next hour, those simple words would expose a conspiracy reaching from a rural Georgia gas station all the way to the Pentagon's highest corridors of power. The morning sun cast long shadows across Interstate 75 as Commander Devin Carter adjusted his Navy dress uniform one final time in the rearview mirror. The silver oak leaves on his collar caught the light, but it wasn't vanity that made him check his appearance. It was a promise he'd made to a dying woman 3 weeks ago when his grandmother had gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "I want to see you one last time looking like the hero you became, not the scared little boy who used to hide under my kitchen table during thunderstorms." His nephew, Tyler, shifted in the passenger seat, pressing his face against the window as they passed through the Georgia countryside. At 10 years old, Tyler had inherited the Carter family's curious nature and their stubborn refusal to let important questions go unanswered. "Uncle Devin, why do you have so many ribbons on your uniform? Some of the kids at school say their dads have 1 or 2, but you've got like a whole rainbow." Devin smiled, the first genuine expression to cross his face since they'd left Jacksonville that morning. Tyler had been asking questions like this for the entire 3-hour drive, each one more insightful than most adults managed. "Well, each ribbon tells a story, buddy. Some are for places I've been, some are for things I've done, and some—" He paused, touching the Purple Heart ribbon with the tip of his finger. "Some are for times when other people didn't make it home and I did." Tyler considered this with the serious expression he wore whenever adults talked about things that mattered, like my dad. The question hit Devin harder than he'd expected, even though they'd had variations of this conversation many times before. Tyler's father, Devin's younger brother Marcus, had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago, leaving behind a widow who couldn't handle raising a boy who looked exactly like his father, and a brother who'd stepped in without hesitation to fill the void. "Yeah, buddy. Like your dad. I think Grandma Rose would be proud of both of you," Tyler said, settling back into his seat with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. She always said the Carter men were protectors, not because they were big and strong, but because they couldn't stand to see people get hurt when they could do something about it. Devin felt his throat tighten. Rose Carter had raised him after his own parents died in a car accident when he was 12, turning a grieving boy into a man who understood that strength meant standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. She'd lived to see him graduate from the Naval Academy, earn his SEAL Trident, and receive commendations for operations he couldn't discuss even with family. But she'd also lived to see Marcus come home in a flag-draped coffin, and Devin knew that had broken something in her that never quite healed. "She was proud of you too, you know," Devin said, reaching over to ruffle Tyler's hair. "She used to tell everyone at the church about her great-grandson who asked better questions than most college professors and never forgot to call her every Sunday." Tyler grinned, but then his expression grew thoughtful again. "Uncle Devin, are you nervous about something? You keep checking your mirrors and you've got that same look you had when you taught me to ride my bike without training wheels." The kid was too observant for his own good. Devin had been checking his mirrors, though not for the reasons most people would expect. 3 days ago, he'd received a call from Admiral Wellington at the Pentagon, informing him that his scheduled testimony before the Congressional Oversight Committee regarding Black Sabre Solutions had been moved up. The private military contractor had been lobbying for a multi-billion-dollar contract in Somalia, but Devin's intelligence reports documented human rights violations that made them unsuitable for government work. Someone had leaked the testimony schedule, and the Admiral had warned Devin to be careful. "Just want to make sure we get to the funeral home on time," Devin said, which wasn't entirely a lie. They were running later than he'd planned, thanks to Tyler's insistence on stopping at every historical marker along the route to read the plaques aloud. Grandma Rose always said punctuality was a form of respect. Tyler nodded sagely, then returned to watching the landscape roll by. They were deep in rural Georgia, now the kind of country where Spanish moss draped over oak trees like funeral shrouds and towns appeared suddenly out of nowhere, existing for a few blocks before disappearing back into pine forests. It was beautiful in its way, but it also felt isolated, cut off from the larger world in a manner that could be either peaceful or dangerous, depending on who you were and what you represented. 200 miles away in the Sheriff's Department of Millbrook County, Deputy Blake Morrison stared at the encrypted message on his personal phone with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Morrison was a man who'd spent his entire adult life searching for shortcuts to the respect and authority he felt the world owed him, and this opportunity represented the biggest payday of his career. The message was simple: high-value target traveling south on I-75. Silver Toyota Camry, license plate JNK4472. Intercept at your discretion. Payment upon successful detention. Target must be held until after Friday. Use any means necessary. Morrison's platinum blonde hair caught the fluorescent light as he leaned back in his chair studying the attached photograph of Commander Devin Carter. The image showed a black man in navy dress blues chest heavy with ribbons and decorations that Morrison dismissed as probably fake. In his experience, people like Carter were all about putting on airs, pretending to be something they weren't, to get special treatment from bleeding heart liberals who bought into the hero worship nonsense. Sheriff Wade Hutchins walked into the bullpen coffee, staining his uniform shirt, and the perpetual scowl he wore when dealing with paperwork etched deep into his weathered face. Hutchins was Morrison's mentor in all the ways that mattered, having taught him that the law was whatever you could get away with, especially when dealing with outsiders who didn't understand how things worked in rural Georgia. "Got something for you," Blake Hutchins said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair behind Morrison's desk without invitation. "Remember that consulting job we discussed? The one that could set us up for early retirement?" Morrison nodded, though they'd never called it consulting before. For the past 5 years, Hutchins had been running what he called a toll collection service for travelers passing through Millbrook County. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Deputies would pull over out-of-state drivers for minor infractions, find reasons to search their vehicles, and then offer to resolve any legal complications for immediate cash payments to avoid the hassle of court appearances and lawyer fees. The money went into a shell company that Hutchins had set up with profits distributed among the deputies who participated, and larger shares going to the county judge and district attorney who made sure the right paperwork got filed. This one's different. Hutchins continued lowering his voice even though they were alone in the office. Big money involved, federal money. All you have to do is pick up one guy, hold him for the weekend, and make sure he doesn't make any phone calls until Monday morning. Morrison felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Federal money meant federal risks, but it also meant federal rewards. His wife had been nagging him about the mortgage on their new house, and his daughter needed braces, and the boat payment was already 2 months behind. One weekend's work could solve all of those problems and probably pay for the vacation to Panama City they'd been talking about for 3 years. "What's the charge?" Morrison asked already, mentally rehearsing the arrest scenario. "Whatever works," Hutchins replied with a shrug. "Guy's supposed to be some kind of military hotshot, so stolen valor might play well. Or you could go with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, anything that gives you probable cause to bring him in. The important thing is that he stays in our custody until the people paying us get what they need." Morrison looked at the photograph again, studying the man's face and trying to imagine how the confrontation would play out. Carter looked confident, the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were better than the people around you, and Morrison felt his old resentments stirring. He'd grown up in Millbrook County watching black families move into the nicer neighborhoods while his own family struggled to keep their trailer from being repossessed. He joined the sheriff's department partly out of a genuine desire to serve and protect, but mostly because it was the only job available that came with a badge and the authority to make people respect him whether they wanted to or not. The Sunshine Quick Stop appeared out of the pine trees like a mirage, its faded yellow signs advertising gas, cold drinks, and live bait in letters that hadn't been repainted since the Clinton administration. Devin pulled into the station cautiously, noting the lack of security cameras and the isolated location that made it perfect for the kind of trouble his instincts were warning him to expect. Tyler unbuckled his seatbelt and stretched, looking around at the rural setting with the kind of curiosity that made Devin both proud and worried. "This doesn't look like the gas stations near our house, Uncle Devin. It looks like something from a movie about the old days." "Stay close to me, buddy," Devin said, checking his surroundings one more time before opening his door. Sometimes old-fashioned places have old-fashioned ideas about things. They walked toward the gas pumps together, Tyler chattering about the differences between rural and urban architecture, while Devin maintained the situational awareness that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. The station attendant, a teenager with scared eyes and nervous hands, watched them through the bulletproof glass with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Tyler noticed immediately. "Uncle Devin, why does that kid look like he's seen a ghost?" "We're just buying gas." Before Devin could answer, the distinctive sound of a police siren whooped behind them, followed by the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. A Millbrook County Sheriff's Department cruiser pulled into the station, parking at an angle that blocked their exit route, and Deputy Blake Morrison climbed out with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who wanted everyone to know he was in charge. Morrison was exactly what Devin had expected to encounter in a place like this, a white man in his early 40s with platinum blonde hair and the kind of swagger that came from years of unchecked authority. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge polished to a mirror shine, and his hand rested casually but threateningly on the grip of his service weapon as he approached. "Well, well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the exaggerated drawl that some Southerners used when they wanted to emphasize the distance between themselves and outsiders. "What do we have here? Little boy playing dress-up in Daddy's costume." Tyler moved instinctively closer to Devin, his child's radar picking up the hostility that radiated from Morrison like heat from asphalt. "Uncle Devin, why is he talking to you like that? You're wearing a real uniform." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he focused on Tyler, for the first time taking in the family resemblance and the protective way Devin positioned himself between the deputy and his nephew. "That your kid soldier boy teaching him early how to disrespect law enforcement?" Devin felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level and professional. "Officer, I'm Commander Devin Carter, United States Navy. My nephew and I are traveling to a funeral and we stopped for gas." "Is there some kind of problem?" Commander Morrison spat tobacco juice onto the asphalt near Devin's polished dress shoes. "Funny thing about that. See, I've got a nose for stolen valor cases and you smell like a fake to me. Real Navy officers don't drive around in rental cars wearing Halloween costumes." Tyler looked up at Devin with confusion and growing anger. "Uncle Devin, why doesn't he believe you? You've got pictures of yourself with other sailors and all those medals, and Admiral Wellington called you last week about that important meeting." The mention of Admiral Wellington made Morrison pause, though he covered his uncertainty with increased aggression. "Kid's got quite an imagination. Tell you what, Commander Fake, why don't you step away from the vehicle and let me see some identification? Real identification, not the kind you buy on the internet." Devin reached slowly toward his wallet, making sure to telegraph his movements to avoid giving Morrison an excuse for escalation. "My military ID is right here, Deputy. You can verify it through the Pentagon if you'd like." But Morrison was already shaking his head, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt. "Don't reach for nothing, boy. Put your hands on the hood of that car and spread your legs. You're under arrest for stolen valor and probably a few other things I'll think of on the way to the station." "Uncle Devin." Tyler whispered, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. "What's happening? Why won't he listen to you?" Devin looked down at his nephew, seeing the beginning of a lesson he'd hoped Tyler would never have to learn, at least not this young. Sometimes buddy people see what they want to see instead of what's really there. But the truth has a way of coming out in the end. Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with excitement and authority. "Turn around now, or this gets a lot worse for both of you." As Devin slowly complied, placing his hands on the warm metal of the rental car, he caught sight of another police cruiser pulling into the station. Deputy Sarah Chen climbed out, her young face already showing concern at the scene unfolding before her, and Devin felt a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in Millbrook County had forgotten what justice was supposed to look like. Deputy Sarah Chen had been a police officer for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, but she'd never seen anything like the scene that greeted her at the Sunshine Quick Stop. Blake Morrison was standing behind a black man in what appeared to be a genuine Navy dress uniform, roughly forcing handcuffs onto wrists that weren't resisting, while a young boy watched with tears streaming down his face. "Blake, what's going on here?" Chen called out as she approached, her hand instinctively moving to the body camera on her chest to make sure it was recording. Something about this situation felt wrong in ways she couldn't immediately articulate, but her training and her conscience both told her to document everything. "Got ourselves a stolen valor case," Sarah Morrison replied, breathing hard from the exertion of manhandling someone who clearly wasn't fighting back. This clown was trying to pass himself off as some kind of war hero to impress the kid and probably get a military discount on his Snickers bar. Chen studied the man Morrison was arresting, noting the perfect military bearing even in handcuffs, the way his ribbons were arranged with mathematical precision, and most importantly, the calm dignity with which he accepted the humiliation being forced upon him. She'd grown up in a military family, and she knew the difference between someone wearing a costume and someone wearing the uniform they'd earned through blood and sacrifice. "Sir, what's your name?" Chen asked, pulling out her notebook despite Morrison's disapproving glare. "Commander Devin Carter, United States Navy Service, number 1-247-8963-4521. Devin replied in the crisp, clear voice of someone accustomed to giving reports under pressure. "My nephew, Tyler Carter, and I are traveling to my grandmother's funeral in Valdosta. My military identification is in my wallet, which Deputy Morrison confiscated without examining." Tyler stepped forward, wiping his nose on his sleeve and looking at Chen with the desperate hope of a child who still believed adults would do the right thing if they just understood what was happening. "Ma'am, Uncle Devin really is a Navy commander. He's got medals for saving people in Afghanistan, and he's supposed to talk to Congress next week about important stuff. Why won't Deputy Morrison look at his ID?" Morrison grabbed Devin roughly by the arm, steering him toward the police cruiser. "Kid's been coached, obviously. Probably part of some elaborate scam these people run to get sympathy and free stuff. Sarah, you can follow us back to the station and help with the booking." But Chen was studying Tyler's face, seeing something that made her police instincts tingle with suspicion. Children were notoriously bad liars, especially when they were scared and emotional, but this boy was providing specific details that would be easy to verify. Military service numbers, Congressional testimony, even the mention of Afghanistan operations. These weren't the kinds of things a 10-year-old would know unless they were true. Blake. Maybe we should verify the identification before we transport him. Chen suggested, carefully knowing that challenging Morrison directly would only make things worse. "It would only take a minute, and if he's lying, we'll have him dead to rights." Morrison's face darkened with anger, and he yanked Devin's ribbons from his uniform with enough force to tear the fabric. The Purple Heart, Silver Star, and Navy Cross clattered onto the asphalt like discarded bottle caps, and Tyler cried out as if he'd been physically struck. "Uncle Devin, he broke your medals." Tyler ran toward the fallen ribbons, but Morrison blocked his path with an outstretched arm. "Evidence," Morrison said with a cruel smile. "Can't have you tampering with evidence, kid." Devin spoke for the first time since being handcuffed, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both deputies pause. "Deputy Morrison, Those decorations represent the sacrifice of men who died protecting the freedom you're currently abusing. I strongly suggest you pick them up." Something in Devon's tone made Morrison take a step backward, but his pride and his commitment to the arrest scenario prevented him from backing down. "You threatening me, boy? Sarah, did you hear him threaten a police officer?" Chen had heard no such thing, but she'd heard something else in Devon's voice that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't the voice of someone pretending to be military. This was the voice of someone who'd commanded men in combat, someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who understood violence in ways that small-town deputies could barely imagine. "Blake, I think we should call the sheriff," Chen said, trying to buy time while she figured out what to do. If this guy really is active military, arresting him without cause could create serious problems for the department. Morrison forced Devon into the back of his cruiser, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. "Sheriff already knows, Sarah. This arrest is approved at the highest levels. Your job is to follow orders, not ask questions." Tyler ran to Chen, grabbing her by the arm with the desperation of a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. "Deputy Chen, please listen to me. Uncle Devon told me that if anything bad ever happened, I should remember that truth is like water. It always finds a way to the surface. He's not lying about being in the Navy. He's not lying about anything." Chen looked down at the boy, seeing her younger brother in his earnest face, and made a decision that would change the course of her career and possibly her life. "Tyler, I'm going to follow you and your uncle to the station, and I'm going to make some phone calls. Sometimes truth needs help finding its way to the surface." As Morrison's cruiser pulled away from the gas station, Tyler riding in Chen's car behind them, none of them could have imagined that within the next hour, the quiet afternoon in rural Georgia would be shattered by the sound of helicopters and the arrival of federal agents armed with warrants and handcuffs of their own. The Millbrook County Sheriff's Department occupied a brick building that had been constructed in the 1960s with all the architectural charm of a public restroom. But Tyler Carter found himself fascinated by the institutional efficiency of the place as Deputy Chen led him through the front entrance. Everything was designed to process people efficiently, from the metal detector at the door to the rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor in the waiting area. "Deputy Chen, why do police stations always smell like that?" Tyler asked, wrinkling his nose at the combination of disinfectant coffee and human anxiety that permeated the air. Like what Honey Chen asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. Every police station smelled the same, a mixture of stress and institutional cleaning supplies that became invisible to officers after a few months, but remained obvious to civilians. Like people who are scared but trying not to show it. Tyler said, with the matter-of-fact perception that sometimes made adults forget he was only 10 years old. "Uncle Devon smells different when he's worried about something, but he's not scared the same way. He's worried about me seeing something I shouldn't see, not about what's going to happen to him." Chen felt her stomach twist as she guided Tyler to a chair near her desk. The kid was reading the situation with uncomfortable accuracy, picking up on dynamics that most adults would miss. She'd been a police officer long enough to recognize genuine fear versus the kind of tactical concern that came from experience with dangerous situations. "Tyler, I need to ask you some questions about your uncle. Okay?" Chen said gently, pulling out her notebook and trying to project the kind of calm authority that would reassure a frightened child. "Can you tell me exactly what kind of work he does in the Navy?" Tyler's face lit up with pride, the shadow of fear momentarily replaced by enthusiasm for his favorite subject. "Uncle Devon is a SEAL, which means he's like a super soldier who goes on secret missions to protect America. He can't tell me about most of the stuff he does because it's classified, but sometimes he shows me pictures of the places he's been, and he's got scars from times when bad guys tried to hurt him, but he was too tough to give up." "Does he ever talk about his medals or decorations?" Chen continued making notes while keeping one eye on the hallway where Blake Morrison was presumably booking Devon. "Oh yeah, he knows everything about all of them." Tyler said, launching into the kind of detailed recitation that only comes from genuine knowledge. The Purple Heart is for when you get hurt fighting for your country, and Uncle Devin got his when a bomb went off near his truck in Afghanistan. The Silver Star is for being really brave when other people are in danger, and he got that for saving 3 soldiers who were trapped in a building. The Navy Cross is like the second highest medal you can get, and he earned it for a mission he can't talk about. But Admiral Wellington told me once that Uncle Devin is the kind of person who runs toward danger when everyone else is running away. Chen stopped writing and looked up at Tyler with growing concern. Children could repeat things they'd been told, but this level of specific detail combined with the casual mention of an admiral by name suggested either an elaborate coaching scheme or the simple truth of a boy who'd grown up around military excellence. Tyler, you mentioned Admiral Wellington earlier. How do you know him? He comes to our house for dinner sometimes, Tyler said, as if entertaining admirals was the most normal thing in the world. He and Uncle Devin served together when they were younger, and now Admiral Wellington works at the Pentagon. He's really nice, and he always brings me books about airplanes and ships. Last time he visited, he told Uncle Devin that some people in Congress wanted to hear about bad things that military contractors were doing in Africa, and Uncle Devin said he'd tell them the truth, even if it made powerful people angry. Chen felt her blood pressure spike. Congressional testimony about military contractors could involve millions of dollars in government contracts, the kind of money that made people do desperate things to protect their interests. If Tyler was telling the truth, and Devin Carter really was scheduled to testify about corruption in the defense industry, then this arrest could be about something much bigger than stolen valor. Sheriff Hutchins emerged from his office at that moment, coffee-stained belly leading the way, as he surveyed the scene with the territorial suspicion of a man who'd spent too many years protecting his turf from outside interference. Deputy Chen. What's the kid doing here? This is a police station, not a daycare center. Sheriff Tyler is the nephew of the man Deputy Morrison arrested, Chen explained, standing up to show proper respect while positioning herself protectively near Tyler's chair. He was with his uncle when the arrest occurred, and I thought it would be appropriate to keep him safe while we sorted out the details. Hutchins looked down at Tyler with the kind of dismissive glance that adults sometimes gave children when they wanted to pretend they weren't listening. Kid, your uncle's in some serious trouble. Pretending to be a soldier is a federal crime, and we don't take kindly to that kind of disrespect around here. Maybe this will teach him to stick to telling the truth. Tyler stood up from his chair, drawing himself up to his full 4 feet and 8 inches of height, and looked Sheriff Hutchins directly in the eye with the fearless directness of a child who'd been raised to believe that truth mattered more than consequence. Sheriff Hutchins' Uncle Devin doesn't pretend to be anything. He is a Navy commander, and he's earned every medal on his uniform by protecting people like you. Why don't you want to check his identification? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, simple and devastating in its innocence. Chen watched Hutchins' face redden as he struggled to find an answer that didn't reveal the true nature of what was happening. Boy, you don't question adults in this building. Hutchins finally managed his voice tight with anger. Your uncle is a criminal, and criminals don't get the benefit of the doubt. But you haven't proven he's a criminal yet, Tyler pointed out with relentless logic. Uncle Devin always tells me that in America people are innocent until proven guilty, and proof means evidence, not just saying something is true. Where's your evidence? Chen realized she was witnessing something remarkable. A 10-year-old boy dismantling the entire premise of a corrupt arrest through nothing more than honest questions. Deputy Chen Tyler said, turning to her with a smile on her face. I'm not sure what you're talking about, she said. I'm just trying to do my job. Deputy Chen Tyler said, turning to her with the trust that children placed in adults who showed them basic kindness. Could you please call Admiral Wellington? I know his phone number. If Uncle Devin is lying about being in the Navy, Admiral Wellington will tell you. But if Uncle Devin is telling the truth, then someone needs to explain to me why police officers are allowed to arrest innocent people. Chen looked at Hutchins. saw the panic beginning to creep into his eyes, and made the decision that would define the rest of her career in law enforcement. Tyler. I think that's an excellent idea. Why don't you give me that phone number? The holding cell in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department had been designed by someone who understood that hope was the enemy of compliance, with gray concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and just enough space for a man to pace 3 steps in any direction before hitting a barrier. Devin Carter sat on the metal bench with perfect military posture, his torn uniform a visible reminder of the injustice that had brought him here while he waited for the next phase of what he now understood was a carefully orchestrated operation. Through the reinforced glass window, he could see Tyler sitting next to Deputy Chen's desk, engaging in what appeared to be an increasingly animated conversation with Sheriff Hutchins. Even without being able to hear the words, Devin could read the body language clearly enough. Tyler was asking questions that the adults couldn't answer, and Hutchins was growing more agitated by the minute. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Chen's approach, and Devin stood as she appeared outside his cell with a cell phone in her hand and an expression that suggested she'd reached some kind of decision. Commander Carter, I need you to understand that I'm taking a significant risk here, Chen said, quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Hutchins wasn't watching. Tyler gave me a phone number for someone called Admiral Wellington. He says you're scheduled to testify before Congress next week about military contractor fraud, and that powerful people might want to prevent that testimony from happening. Devin felt a surge of pride in his nephew mixed with concern about Tyler's safety if the situation escalated further. Deputy Chen Tyler is correct on all counts. I'm scheduled to testify before the Senate Oversight Committee regarding human rights violations by Black Saber Solutions, a private military contractor seeking a multi-billion-dollar contract in Somalia. My testimony could result in the cancellation of that contract, and someone might be willing to pay local law enforcement to keep you locked up until after that hearing, Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. It would be a relatively inexpensive way to discredit my testimony, Devin confirmed. If I'm arrested for stolen valor or assault on a police officer, the Senate committee would likely postpone my appearance indefinitely while the criminal charges are resolved. By the time I'm cleared, the contract will be signed and the opportunity for oversight will have passed. Chen looked at the phone in her hand, obviously weighing the career implications of what she was considering. Tyler seems to think that Admiral Wellington can verify your identity and your testimony schedule. Is that true? Admiral Wellington is my former commanding officer and current supervisor for my Pentagon consulting work, Devin said. He can verify everything Tyler told you, and he can also explain what happens when a Navy SEAL disappears into a rural county jail without due process. Chen slipped the phone through the bars, her hand shaking slightly as she committed to a course of action that would either vindicate her instincts or destroy her career. Commander, if you're lying to me about any of this, I'll personally make sure you spend the next decade in prison. But if you're telling the truth, then my department is involved in something that I swore an oath to prevent. Devin took the phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he dialed a number he'd memorized during his first deployment. The line connected immediately, bypassing the normal Pentagon switchboard routing that would have taken minutes to navigate. Secure line Admiral Wellington speaking, came the crisp voice that Devin had heard give orders in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Admiral, this is Wraith Devin, said using the call sign that identified him within the Pentagon's Special Operations community. I have a situation report, sir. I am being held unlawfully by local law enforcement in Millbrook County, Georgia. My uniform has been damaged, and I have been denied access to legal counsel. I believe this detention is connected to my scheduled congressional testimony regarding Black Saber Solutions. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing as Wellington pulled up Devin's file and cross-referenced it with current threat assessments. Wraith, confirm your location and the nature of the charges against you. I'm being held at the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department on fabricated charges of stolen valor and assault on a police officer, Devin replied. The arresting deputy Blake Morrison showed no interest in verifying my identification and became hostile when my nephew mentioned your name. Sir, I believe this arrest was coordinated with outside parties who want to prevent my testimony. Wellington's voice took on the cold edge that Devon remembered from combat briefings when the mission parameters had suddenly changed. Wraith, I'm looking at intelligence reports that suggest Black Saber Solutions has been making inquiries about your testimony schedule and personal travel plans. If they've engaged local law enforcement to interfere with a federal witness, this becomes a matter of national security. Sir, my nephew Tyler is with me, and he's currently in the custody of Deputy Sarah Chen, who appears to be acting in good faith. Devon continued. I request immediate federal intervention to ensure Tyler's safety and to preserve the integrity of the congressional oversight process. Consider it done, Wellington said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who could mobilize military assets with a phone call. I'm activating federal protective protocols, and I'm dispatching a joint FBI-NCIS team to your location. Maintain your current position and do not engage hostile forces unless absolutely necessary for your protection or your nephew's safety. Devon handed the phone back to Chen, who took it with obviously trembling hands. Deputy Chen, in approximately 30 minutes, federal agents are going to arrive at this facility with warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in this conspiracy. I strongly suggest you document everything that has happened since my arrest and prepare to cooperate fully with their investigation. Chen stared at him through the bars, her face pale as the implications of the situation became clear. Commander, what about Tyler? What happens to him when the FBI arrives? Tyler will be protected, Devon said with absolute certainty. He's a federal witness now, and his safety is guaranteed by the full resources of the United States government. But Deputy Chen, you have a choice to make in the next few minutes. You can continue to follow Sheriff Hutchins' orders and become part of this conspiracy, or you can stand up for the oath you took when you became a police officer. Through the window, they could see Tyler still talking to Hutchins, his young voice carrying clearly enough for them to hear fragments of his questions. Sheriff, why won't you call Admiral Wellington? Are you afraid of what he might tell you? Chen closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made the decision that would define not only her career, but her integrity as a human being. Commander Carter, I'm going to document everything, and I'm going to protect your nephew until the federal agents arrive. If that costs me my job, then maybe this wasn't the right job for me anyway. As she walked back toward the main office, Devon felt a surge of hope that justice might prevail, not through his own actions, but through the courage of a young deputy and the fearless honesty of a 10-year-old boy who refused to accept that adults were allowed to ignore the truth when it became inconvenient. The first sign that the balance of power in Millbrook County was about to shift came as a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, growing steadily louder until the windows of the sheriff's department began to vibrate in their frames. Tyler Carter looked up from his conversation with Sheriff Hutchins, his face lighting up with excitement as he recognized the distinctive sound of military helicopters approaching at high speed. Sheriff Hutchins. Why do you look so scared? Tyler asked with the innocent directness that had been making adults uncomfortable all afternoon. Those are probably the good guys coming to help Uncle Devon. You should be happy that we're going to get this whole misunderstanding sorted out. Hutchins was definitely not happy. The color had drained from his face as he stared out the window at the approaching aircraft, and his hands were shaking as he reached for his radio to call Deputy Morrison back from his patrol route. But before he could key the microphone, the parking lot outside exploded into controlled chaos as two Black Hawk helicopters settled onto the asphalt with military precision. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez was the first person out of the lead aircraft, followed by a team of FBI agents and NCIS investigators, who moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd trained for exactly this kind of operation. Rodriguez had spent 15 years investigating corruption cases involving military personnel and government contracts, and she'd learned to recognize the specific type of panic that overtook civilian law enforcement when they realized they'd overplayed their hand. Tyler Carter Rodriguez called out as she entered the sheriff's department, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing and pay attention. Tyler jumped up from his chair and ran toward her with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been waiting all day for an adult to take his concerns seriously. "Yes, ma'am. Are you here to help Uncle Devin? Because he really is a Navy commander, and he didn't do anything wrong, and I can prove it if anyone wants to listen to me." Rodriguez knelt down to Tyler's eye level, noting the tears that had dried on his face, and the protective way Deputy Chen positioned herself near the boy. "Tyler, I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI, and I'm here because Admiral Wellington at the Pentagon asked us to check on you and your uncle. Can you tell me exactly what happened today?" Deputy Morrison arrested Uncle Devin for wearing a fake uniform. "But it's not fake." Tyler said the words, tumbling out in a rush of relief at finally finding an adult who seemed interested in hearing the truth. "Uncle Devin has pictures of himself with other sailors, and he knows all about his medals, and he was supposed to talk to Congress about bad people doing bad things with money, and I think maybe someone doesn't want him to tell Congress the truth." Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten as Tyler's account confirmed the intelligence briefing she'd received during the helicopter ride from Atlanta. Black Saber Solutions had been under FBI surveillance for 3 weeks ever since Pentagon analysts had flagged unusual financial transfers to shell companies in several rural counties along major interstate highways. "Agent Rodriguez, I'm Deputy Sarah Chen," Chen said, stepping forward with her notebook and body camera footage queued up on her phone. "I've documented everything that happened during Commander Carter's arrest, and I have concerns about the legitimacy of the charges filed against him." Rodriguez studied Chen's face, seeing the kind of moral conflict that occurred when good police officers found themselves caught between their oath and their chain of command. "Deputy Chen, where is Commander Carter being held?" "He's in holding cell 3. Chen replied, glancing nervously at Sheriff Hutchins, who was watching the conversation with the expression of a man who knew his world was about to collapse. Sheriff Hutchins has refused to allow him access to legal counsel or the opportunity to verify his military identification. At the mention of his name, Hutchins stepped forward with a blustering attempt at authority that fooled no one present. "Agent Rodriguez, I don't know who's been filling your head with nonsense, but we arrested a man for stolen valor and assault on a police officer. This is a local matter, and federal jurisdiction doesn't apply." Rodriguez stood up to her full height, which at 5 feet 10 inches was enough to look Hutchins directly in the eye, and smiled with the predatory expression that federal agents reserved for local officials who thought they could obstruct justice without consequences. "Sheriff Hutchins, interfering with a federal witness is a felony, regardless of what local charges you've fabricated. But since you mentioned jurisdiction, I should probably mention that we have warrants for your arrest. Deputy Morrison's arrest and the seizure of all financial records related to your department's interactions with Black Saber Solutions." The sound of additional helicopters landing outside was followed by the arrival of more federal agents, these carrying the kind of equipment that suggested they planned to conduct a thorough investigation of every computer phone and filing cabinet in the building. Tyler watched the controlled chaos with fascination, his fear finally beginning to give way to excitement as he realized that the adults were finally taking his uncle's situation seriously. "Agent Rodriguez, can I see Uncle Devin now?" Tyler asked, tugging on the agent's sleeve with the persistence of a child who'd learned that polite requests sometimes got better results than demands. "I want to make sure he's okay, and I want to tell him that the good guys finally showed up." Rodriguez looked at Chen, who nodded toward the hallway that led to the holding cells. "Deputy Chen, would you please escort Tyler to see his uncle while my team processes the arrest warrants?" As they walked toward the back of the building, Tyler chattering excitedly about helicopters and FBI agents. Rodriguez turned her attention to Hutchins, who was now sitting heavily in his chair with the defeated expression of a man who understood that his career in law enforcement was effectively over. "Sheriff, We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Rodriguez said, pulling out handcuffs that looked remarkably similar to the ones Morrison had used on Devon earlier that afternoon. "But either way, you're going to tell us exactly who paid you to arrest Commander Carter, and you're going to explain why you thought interfering with congressional testimony was worth destroying your career and your freedom." 3 hours later, after the initial chaos of arrests and evidence seizure had settled into the methodical rhythm of a federal investigation, Agent Rodriguez made a decision that surprised everyone involved in the case. Instead of immediately transporting all the suspects to Atlanta for processing, she arranged for what she called a restorative justice conference in the Sheriff's Department's main meeting room. Tyler sat between Devon and Deputy Chen, swinging his legs from a chair that was too tall for him, while he studied the faces of the adults gathered around the conference table. Deputy Morrison was handcuffed to his chair, his platinum blonde hair disheveled, and his face red with shame and fear, while Sheriff Hutchins slumped at the opposite end of the table like a deflated balloon. "The purpose of this meeting," Rodriguez explained, "is not to determine guilt or innocence. We have enough evidence for those determinations already. The purpose is to understand how a decorated Navy SEAL ended up handcuffed in a county jail cell, and whether the people responsible for that injustice are capable of understanding the harm they've caused." Devon, now wearing a fresh uniform that had been brought by the military liaison team, looked across the table at Morrison with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. "Deputy Morrison, I'd like you to explain to my nephew why you arrested me without examining my identification." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his restraints, avoiding eye contact with Tyler, whose intense gaze seemed to strip away all the justifications and excuses he'd been preparing. I thought you were probably lying. We get a lot of people through here who try to scam their way out of tickets by claiming to be military." Tyler leaned forward in his chair, his young face serious with concentration. "Mr. Morrison, did you ask Uncle Devon any questions about the military? Like, did you ask him what his job was, or where he's been stationed, or what his medals are for?" "No," Morrison admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" Tyler continued with the relentless logic of a child who couldn't understand why adults would choose ignorance over knowledge. "If you thought he was lying, wouldn't questions be a good way to find out the truth?" Morrison looked around the room, searching for support that wasn't coming from anyone present. "Kid, sometimes you just know things okay. Sometimes you can tell when someone doesn't belong." Tyler tilted his head, studying Morrison with the kind of focused attention that made adults uncomfortable when they realized a 10-year-old was seeing through their carefully constructed rationalizations. "Mr. Morrison, Uncle Devon doesn't belong in a jail cell, but that's where you put him. Maybe the problem isn't that Uncle Devon doesn't belong somewhere. Maybe the problem is that you don't understand where you belong." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, simple and devastating in their innocence. Devon felt a surge of pride in his nephew, mixed with sadness that Tyler was learning these lessons so young, but also hope that maybe something positive could emerge from this traumatic experience. Rodriguez leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she watched Tyler navigate the emotional complexity of the situation with remarkable wisdom. "Tyler, what do you think Mr. Morrison should do now?" Tyler considered the question with the seriousness he gave to all important problems, his young face scrunched up in concentration as he weighed different possibilities. "Well, he should say he's sorry, obviously. But more than that, he should try to understand why he made such a big mistake. Uncle Devon always tells me that mistakes are only really bad if you don't learn anything from them." Morrison finally looked directly at Tyler, and Devon could see something breaking in the deputy's expression, a wall of defensiveness crumbling under the weight of a child's simple expectation that adults should be capable of growth and change. "Tyler, I am sorry," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong about your uncle, and I was wrong about a lot of other things. I let my own problems and my own anger make me into someone who hurt innocent people, and that's not who I wanted to be when I became a police officer." Tyler nodded solemnly, as if accepting Morrison's apology was both a privilege and a responsibility. "Mr. Morrison, do you think you could learn to be a better person? Because Uncle Devin says that everyone has the choice to be better than they were yesterday, even when they've made really bad mistakes." Rodriguez watched the exchange with professional fascination, noting how Tyler's presence was transforming what should have been a routine interrogation into something approaching genuine reconciliation. She'd seen victim-offender dialogues before, but never one facilitated by a 10-year-old who seemed to understand restorative justice better than most trained mediators. "Deputy Morrison Rodriguez said you're facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison, but your cooperation with our investigation into Black Saber Solutions could potentially reduce your sentence significantly. Are you prepared to tell us everything you know about how this conspiracy was organized?" Morrison looked at Tyler one more time, seeing in the boy's earnest face the kind of forgiveness that he'd never expected to receive, and certainly didn't deserve. "Agent Rodriguez, I'll tell you everything. Sheriff Hutchins has been running a corruption scheme for years, taking money from anyone willing to pay to have problems disappear. But this was different. This was about stopping Commander Carter from testifying to Congress, and the people who hired us made it clear that failure wasn't an option." Tyler turned to his uncle, his young face bright with the satisfaction of seeing justice begin to emerge from chaos. "Uncle Devin, do you forgive Mr. Morrison?" Devin looked across the table at the man who had humiliated him, torn his uniform, and traumatized his nephew, and found himself thinking about the lessons he'd learned in combat about the difference between enemies and people who'd made terrible choices under pressure. "Tyler, forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once," Devin said, carefully choosing his words to provide both honesty and hope. "Mr. Morrison hurt us today, and that pain doesn't just disappear because he's apologized. But forgiveness is something we can work toward, especially if he's committed to making sure this never happens to anyone else." Tyler nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, then looked around the room at the assembled adults with the confidence of someone who'd successfully navigated a complex moral situation. "Then I think we should all work together to make sure nobody else gets hurt the way we got hurt today, because that's what heroes do, right, Uncle Devin? They don't just fight the bad guys. They help people learn to be good guys." 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the late autumn heat and everything to do with the conclusion of what legal observers were calling the most significant corruption case in Georgia's recent history. Tyler Carter, now 11 years old and 3 inches taller, sat in the front row of the gallery wearing his best suit and the kind of serious expression that suggested he understood the gravity of the proceedings. Devin sat beside him wearing his dress uniform with ribbons that had been replaced and properly mounted, serving as both uncle and legal guardian to a boy who had become something of a celebrity among federal prosecutors for his role in exposing the conspiracy that reached from rural sheriff's departments to corporate boardrooms in Washington. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Patricia Williams said as she prepared to read the verdict that would determine the fate of 4 defendants. "Have you reached a decision in the case of United States versus Blake Morrison?" The jury foreman, a retired teacher who had listened to 6 weeks of testimony about corruption, conspiracy, and the abuse of power, stood with a solemnity that reflected the weight of the evidence they'd considered. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant Blake Morrison guilty on all counts of conspiracy, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice." Tyler squeezed Devin's hand as the sentence was announced: 25 years in federal prison, with the possibility of reduced time if Morrison continued his cooperation with ongoing investigations into other departments that had been compromised by Black Saber Solutions. Sheriff Wade Hutchins received 40 years without the possibility of parole, his decades of corruption finally catching up to him in a courtroom where his political connections carried no weight. The man who had once considered himself untouchable was led away in handcuffs, his career and his freedom ending in the same place where his victims had once begged for mercy. The biggest sentence was reserved for Marcus Reed, the platinum blonde CEO of Black Sabre Solutions, who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy from his corner office in Arlington. 58 years in a federal supermax facility, effectively a life sentence for a man whose arrogance had led him to believe that money and political influence could purchase immunity from justice. But it was the final case that drew the most attention from the media and the public deputy Sarah Chen's commendation hearing, where she was formally recognized for her courage in documenting the conspiracy and protecting Tyler during the federal intervention. Tyler had insisted on speaking at Chen's commendation ceremony, and his testimony provided a perspective on justice that resonated far beyond the courthouse walls. Deputy Chen could have just followed orders like everyone else, Tyler said, his young voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. But she chose to do what was right instead of what was easy, and that's what heroes do. Uncle Devin taught me that being a hero isn't about being the strongest person or the bravest person. It's about being willing to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Chen, who had been promoted to sheriff of Millbrook County in a special election that saw her win by the largest margin in the county's history, wiped tears from her eyes as Tyler continued his remarks. I used to think that justice was something that just happened automatically, like the sun coming up in the morning, Tyler said, looking directly at the federal prosecutors who had become his friends over the past 6 months. But Uncle Devin and Deputy Chen taught me that justice is something people have to choose every day, even when it's hard, and even when it costs them something important. Devin felt his chest tight with pride as he listened to his nephew articulate lessons that had taken Devin decades to learn, expressing them with the clarity that came from a heart that hadn't yet learned to compromise with moral ambiguity. The ceremony concluded with Tyler presenting Chen with a handwritten thank you note that she would frame and hang in her office as a reminder of why she had chosen to become a police officer in the first place. But the real conclusion came later that evening when Devin and Tyler drove back through Millbrook County on their way home to Jacksonville. They stopped at the same gas station where the confrontation had begun, and Tyler insisted on going inside to buy a candy bar from the teenage attendant who had watched the entire arrest from behind bulletproof glass 6 months earlier. "Hey, aren't you the kid who was here when all that FBI stuff happened?" the attendant asked, his eyes widening as he recognized Tyler from the news coverage. "Yes, sir," Tyler replied with the polite confidence that Devin had worked hard to instill in him. "We're just passing through again, and I wanted to see if things felt different now." Different, how the attendant asked, genuinely curious about the perspective of someone who had lived through events that the rest of them had only watched on television. Tyler considered the question with his characteristic seriousness, looking around the gas station that had once been the scene of injustice, but was now just a place where people stopped for fuel and snacks on their way to more important destinations. Different like when you're scared of something in the dark, but then someone turns on the light and you realize it was never as scary as you thought it was, Tyler said finally. The bad stuff that was happening here was only scary because people were too afraid to turn on the light. Now the light is on and good people are in charge, and nobody has to be afraid anymore. 1 year later, Devin and Tyler returned to the Sunshine Quick Stop, but this time as different people in a different world. Tyler, now 12 and showing the first signs of the man he would become, bounded out of their car with the confidence of someone who had learned that justice wasn't just a concept in civics textbooks, but a living thing that required constant tending by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. The gas station looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. The teenage attendant had been replaced by an older woman whose smile was genuine rather than nervous, and the bulletin board by the door was covered with community announcements about county council meetings and volunteer opportunities, rather than the wanted posters and traffic violation warnings that had once dominated the space. "Uncle Devin, do you think the people here remember what happened?" Tyler asked as they walked toward the gas pumps, his voice carrying the kind of thoughtful curiosity that had become his trademark. "I think they remember the important parts," Devon replied, noting how different the atmosphere felt now that fear was no longer the dominant emotion in Millbrook County. "They remember that change is possible when good people decide to act, and they remember that courage can come from unexpected places." As they filled the tank, Sheriff Chen's patrol car pulled into the station, and Tyler waved enthusiastically as she approached with the easy confidence of someone who had earned the respect of her community through service rather than intimidation. "Tyler Carter. Look at you getting all grown up," Chen said, accepting the hug that Tyler offered with the enthusiasm of a boy who had never learned to be suspicious of authority figures. "How's school going? Are you still planning to become a lawyer or a judge, or maybe even president?" "Actually, I've been thinking about becoming a teacher," Tyler said, surprising both adults with his answer. "Uncle Devon says that the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or laws, but with ideas and understanding. I want to help other kids learn that they have the power to make things better, just like I learned." Devon felt his heart swell with pride as he listened to Tyler articulate a worldview that combined idealism with hard-won wisdom, the kind of perspective that could only come from someone who had witnessed both injustice and redemption before his 13th birthday. They drove to the cemetery where Rose Carter had been buried during the chaos of the arrest, the funeral that Devon had missed while sitting in a jail cell. Tyler carried a bouquet of flowers that he had picked himself along with a copy of Devon's Congressional commendation for his testimony that had led to criminal charges against Black Sabre Solutions and comprehensive reforms in military contracting oversight. Standing beside his grandmother's grave, Devon realized that the boy who had started this journey as a frightened nephew had become a young man who understood that heroism wasn't about individual glory, but about lifting others up and creating a world where justice was more than just a promise in the Pledge of Allegiance. "Grandma Rose, we did it," Tyler said quietly, placing the flowers on the grave with the solemnity of someone participating in a sacred ritual. "We showed them that truth really is stronger than lies, and that good people really can win when they work together. Uncle Devon says you would have been proud of us, and I think you would have been proud of Deputy Chen too, because she turned out to be exactly the kind of police officer you always said the world needed." As they walked back to their car, Tyler slipped his hand into Devon's with the unconscious affection of a child who had never doubted that he was loved and protected, even in the darkest moments of their shared ordeal. "Uncle Devon, what's our next adventure going to be?" Devon looked down at his nephew, seeing in Tyler's eager face the future of a country that could still choose justice over convenience, courage over comfort, and hope over cynicism. "I don't know, buddy. But whatever it is, I'm pretty sure we'll figure out how to handle it together." The story of a corrupt sheriff's department brought down by a 10-year-old's questions had become something larger than any of them had expected. A reminder that truth really could triumph over power when ordinary people decided that justice was worth the risk. And in a small corner of rural Georgia, a gas station that had once been a symbol of corruption had become a symbol of redemption, proving that even the smallest light could push back the darkness when wielded by someone brave enough to turn it on. If this story of courage and justice inspired you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can all work together to build communities where truth matters more than power, and where every voice, even the smallest ones, can make a difference. Because sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes justice arrives not in the form of helicopters and federal agents, but in the form of a child brave enough to ask why adults have stopped believing in the principles they claim to defend.